troubling is how it plays out in mainstream media is that we lose focus on what we really should be talking about. And this became some sort of a rallying piece where we talked about misogyny, toxic masculinity and others, and this is not the case to do it. My name is Joseph Neuberger. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I have my own firm, Neuberer and Partners LLP, and I've been practicing since 1993. Our specialty in criminal law tends to deal with mostly domestic and sexual related cases, a lot of which that arise sometimes from high conflict divorces. That's maybe about 60% of the work that we get. And so we have overlap and work often with family lawyers in the family sphere because you need to sort of coordinate what's going on. So, as far as domestic and sexual, I've litigated probably well over 2,000 files, if not a bit more. And as a firm, I've had various lawyers in my office over times who are now judges, but we've litigated close to 10,000 files over the 30 years. We have probably maybe 10 to 15% of our clientele are definitely female clients. They're charged typically, again, in our practice, arising out of domestic related matters. Men are not precluded from bringing forth false allegations in a divorce for the same type of motivations. We also have female clients in other respects. I've represented a few on homicides. We have them. Well, one of them was a client I had for a while, and she had a dispute with her common law spouse and stabbed him. I think she was rather high on drugs at the time, and they got into a dispute. I think it triggered her, and then she stabbed him and he died. So that case was resolved to a manslaughter. We've had other cases involved where a lady was involved in a shooting, which was gang related. There is involvement of more females in gang related activity than you think. We've represented females in human trafficking cases where they are human traffickers. So we've got that type of clientele, but more relevant to what you're doing is we've had females who were charged out of, people are living together under the same house. They're getting into an argument. The soon-to-be ex-husband decides to call police and alleges X, Y, and Z, and then she's removed from the house and charged. So that's very typical of what we see, and it's similar to what we see with men.
Did you start your YouTube channel to spite Amber Heard?
No, but we started this now, I guess going back a little over 2 years ago, and I have no design to be a judge. So after 30 years of practice, we were just sort of frustrated with the narratives that were out there and found that people were not well informed about what government policies are. And so we started this much different than other lawyers. Some lawyers' podcasts are interviewing other lawyers or going over law, and we do some of that, but a lot of ours is just sort of discussions about the state of these cases, and some are studies. And then the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case came up, which was an interesting live sort of specimen to break down and to comment on because it was happening in a very public manner. So it was really helpful to sort of look at both sides and be able to dissect what's at play and why. Again, I don't practice family law, so I have a very specific view of what I see because most of what I see comes out of high conflict divorces. I see the family court system to be quite broken. And unfortunately, it's not set up to resolve. It's set up to frustrate and cause more and more issues. And, when you have a litigant who's bent on pushing conflict and trying to create all sorts of allegations, etc., the system doesn't really discourage it. It doesn't encourage it, but it doesn't discourage it. And so you can have things play out for a long time. And it's interesting, if a party to a divorce really wants to settle, they'll do it in a much more, intelligent and sort of elegant manner than that. If you really want to settle, you're going to reach out in a much more, you're going to use more neutral tone and you're going to try and arrive at it because the party truly does want to resolve. If you really want to gain leverage and you want to cast aspersions on somebody because you're mad, you're angry, you feel bitter or whatever, this is where we see a lot of this. We see this play out also with custody. Because the idea is if you allege a domestic abuse, then that can have an impact on what the custody situation would be. Because normally it should be shared custody 50-50, but clearly these things are done to gain leverage, and then you get a higher award for child support. So it's not unusual. It's unfortunate. It's not, it's common. There are a lot of divorces that go through very smoothly. But what we see is a high percentage of, very conflictual, highly aggressive letters and then pleadings, which then, we see criminal charges arise out of it as well. Let's say you're not in criminal court. Let's say you're divorcing, but you know that she's going to make allegations in the divorce that you've abused her. My advice would be, A, don't call police because you can wind up being charged. 2, it spins backwards. The police come in and they're taking your statement, interview her, and then he winds up charged. I have that all the time. If I was a family lawyer, if it was me, I would recommend sending over a letter to the other side saying that we, divorce, we'd like to resolve it. Here's our proposal. And then when you file, if you have to file the application, you take the high ground. Don't raise these issues, because what will happen is you can always reply. So she will reply then with, X amount of allegations and say all sorts of stuff. And then he can reply to that saying, this isn't true. And I advise, litigants to try and take the high road and don't get mired down into the conflict, because some judges are quite good at seeing who is the one who wants to advance the most conflict here and not resolve. And over time, it does start to backfire on the person who's constantly making the complaints about it. And so I don't necessarily think it's important, if you're just in family court, to get out ahead of it. I think you have to just say, my focus is to have an amicable resolution. We would need to keep the children's best interest in mind. That's where we want to focus. Let's get this done. And let them fucking blow it up with all sorts of insanity. And then you'll just reply in a very, reasoned manner. And I think that can carry the day over time. 2 recent ones that were very good. So one of them we had where the complainant did the typical thing, sent over a demand letter asking for a huge amount of money, then went to police, alleged 2 counts of sex assault. And we were able to get like all their communications, because these people communicated by messaging all the time. And my client was smart enough to keep everything. And then you could see how he was writing her. And he was very submissive in the way he wrote. He was very polite. He was, and she was highly aggressive in some of these methods, like highly aggressive and very controlling. And so I sent him off to somebody for the first time in my career, because he was in such a mess. I just wanted him to get therapy. But what came out at the end of the day was we got expert evidence to say that, in fact, he was abused and has suffered a complex trauma as a result of it. So we called that evidence at trial. And what was also quite amusing was when she was leaving the house, she created this ruse for him to be outside of the condo. She took fucking everything of his. I mean, everything. She took all his banking records, immigration paperwork. She took her sponsorship of his parents. She took his degree off the wall, and she'd set herself up badly, because in the way she did her statement was that my client, it was always the one who like takes things or demands. Anyways, it was just a good cross. And I had all this demonstrative independent evidence to show that, in fact, she was this controlling individual. And we won as a result of that, because the judge accepted the expert evidence and specifically found that what she explained as to our client's nature was just false. Another example was, and this is a really good one, very wealthy couple, divorcing, only been married for 9 months, okay? But they were religiously married and not civilly married. Okay. So I caught her falsifying a certificate of marriage. and I cross-examined her on it, and the judge accepted it's false, and she probably committed an offense under the Marriage Act. And that was all because she specifically in her pleadings in family court wanted half of all his stuff. And we're talking millions of dollars. They'd been together for 9 months. And the reason he didn't want to get civilly married was he was worried precisely about this. So those are two examples where I had other evidence that I was able to establish the fabricated nature of what she was saying. You can never get to a point, I'm sorry, I'll just say this, where you're actually in the house. Like, unless you have a video of the actual incident, you can never exactly say she's lying about a sex assault or she's lying about this. But when you peel apart their credibility, you can establish it's a false allegation motivated by money.
Right. We'll get into credibility because there's now a discourse around how that's being weaponized against someone who speaks about their experiences with a male partner. But I want to ask you this: have you ever had someone that alleges? Have you ever had a client that alleges a false accusation and says, "Hey, they're falsely accusing me"? However, it turned out that they're lying about that false accusation.
So when we use the term false accusation, we will only do that once we're satisfied, based on the evidence that we have, that there is merit to that.
Right.
So you will have clients who will say, this is bullshit, it's false, and then there's no way to firm that up. So there are times where you can't firm it up, and then there are other times where you sort of dig down, you get more evidence, and then you see your client is not being truthful. I mean, we have to be careful as advocates that once we're in a courtroom and making certain statements and allegations, do we have a good faith basis for it? So we don't use these terms lightly, and it just so happens in my practice, we wind up with individuals where we get a large volume of material that we can use as a basis for a cross-examination and to establish a false allegation.
I appreciate that little nuance because I have always wondered that, because how the term is now being used so often nowadays. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. Like, there are rape cases here that was tried in the UK, and it involved high-profile footballers. They were found not guilty of the charge, and immediately the discourse became about false accusations. So I want to ask, just because someone has been found not guilty of committing a crime, does that necessarily mean that the person that complained about does that mean that they were falsely accusing the individual?
No. So let's say, again, you don't have witnesses to this. So these offenses typically happen behind closed doors.
Right.
So if basically all you have is a complainant giving her evidence orally about what happened, and then an accused giving his evidence, unless there's something, extraordinary with cross-examination where you're able to really establish a problem.
Right.
I'll give you a crude example. I had what we call the he said, she said type of case. But as I was cross-examining her about what they had done sexually together, it came out that she had climaxed not once but twice. And so, the argument with the judge became, well, does having an orgasm mean that she consented? And it was kind of funny, and she was a really good judge. And
I'm sorry.
But it's true.
That's the first time me hearing it, so I'm kind of like, what? Consent goes to that as well?
Yeah, so, it was a weird case.
Yeah.
But in that case, I didn't use the term false allegation, but I said, I'm pretty confident that her version of events is not accurate.
All right.
But when you just simply have an acquittal, because the threshold for proof beyond a reasonable doubt is fairly high, and a court or a judge can't conclude one way or the other who's telling the truth, I don't think you can throw around terms of false allegations. I think you just have to say, under the law, he was found not guilty. That means he's innocent, and that's it. Right. It's in cases where I have the benefit, and people come to me because of what we do. So we just get that evidence. I literally had a guy who had cameras in his hallways, not the bedrooms, but cameras in the hallways. And I'll give you two other examples. And she didn't fucking realize they were there. So you could see from that video footage what she was doing.
Right.
We disclosed that and the Crown withdrew. That's a false allegation.
Oh, right.
Right. Another example.
Is that like Eleanor Williams? Sorry. Is that like does it have to be on that level for it to constitute false allegations? Like Eleanor Williams in the UK alleged that she was in a part of a grooming gang, and she went out and she actually bought an hammer and beat herself, falsified Snapchat messages, and all. Does it have to be on that level for you to say, right, that's a false allegation, not necessarily someone who's gone to court and it just found not guilty? Is that the levels that we're talking?
Yeah, so if you want to try and establish a false allegation and you want to either try and get it withdrawn or win it at trial, you've got to have some pretty good evidence.
Right.
And you have to put it together very carefully. The other example was, my client was alleged to have sexually assaulted this woman. They were both having an affair, and they went to a casino. And she said, I wanted nothing to do with him. He basically kidnapped me, and then he forced me into the hotel room and blah, blah, blah. Well, I got all the casino footage.
Right.
And that was like, she was all over him, nonstop. And so that undermined all of her credibility. I'm pretty satisfied that was a false allegation. But that's what I'm talking about. You need something demonstrative to peel away all reliability and credibility of this individual. And that's when you can start talking about false allegations. The rest, where it's not proven beyond a reasonable doubt, under the law, people must be treated as innocent, and that's the end. But I wouldn't throw around the language of a false allegation that easily.
In this case, regarding Depp v. Heard, do you think that this is a great example of a false accusation played out, or is this just one of those moments of, hey, she didn't actually falsely accused, it's just that Depp was not culpable for what she was writing about?
That case was fraught with so many things. Like, her credibility was just so bad. And there's so many motivations for fabrication. And, I think the finding by the jury has to have meaning, because this was, a defamation case. So really, they're having to drill down onto the truth of something, because you can't be defaming somebody if you're telling the truth. Right. So I think this, the jury, after hearing everything, certainly came to the conclusion that she was not telling the truth, that it was not accurate. And I think that's a reasonable conclusion in that case. Who knows what may or may not have happened behind closed doors at other times? But the way this played out was very bad and fraught with all sorts of credibility and reliability issues, and tons of motivating factors to fabricate. And then frankly, the way it was coming out was really unpleasant. And I think that impacted her credibility significantly.
Let me just probe into there a little bit. Which part did you consider was unpleasant? Like, what's an example? Can you give?
Well, I guess my example is first how she spoke about these allegations publicly without naming somebody, and then knowing everybody will know about it, and then her presentation at the court during testimony had a demeanor in court is not something you can always rely on.
Yeah.
But there was a certain there was something very unappetizing about the way she presented herself and answered questions, which I thought really diminished her credibility. And again, the way the allegation came out and how this all got disputed, it's just highly inappropriate.
A lot of discourse has been had around, the subject of abuse and, sexual assault after the case has gone on. They have discussed, it was like creating new terms, or probably reintroducing terms that was already created but not really, maybe not taken seriously. So it was like everything was being thrown into the public sphere at once. Once the verdict went down, misogyny was thrown around,
Toxic masculinity.
Say that again.
Toxic masculinity.
Toxic masculinity, social media, and sway the jury, and they made the wrong decision. So they didn't say that they made the wrong decision. None of them actually said that they made the wrong decision. It's just that they were influenced to make the decision that they did. So how do you think how do you think the mainstream media really handled this important discourse?
Poorly, and I don't trust media that way. It's hard to say, exactly what may have been impacting factors for the jury. I mean, clearly you're dealing with celebrities. Johnny Depp, was a charming witness, I think, and so that can have an impact. There's no doubt about that. I think there was a bit of a, there's the celeb vibe, and then there was the likableness of his one of his lawyers.
Yep.
So I think all this can have an impact. What I find troubling is how it plays out in mainstream media is that we lose focus on what we really should be talking about. And this became some sort of a rallying piece where we talked about misogyny, toxic masculinity and others, and this is not the case to do it on. And there is no doubt that we have a serious problem of domestic violence. There's no doubt that we have a serious problems with sex assaults. And it occurs in all sorts. It occurs in relationships. It occurs, with sports teams. We have that with Hockey Canada in Canada. So these are serious issues. And talking about false allegations isn't a zero-sum game where we say because there's some false allegations does not mean that women are not telling the truth about abuse and men are not telling the truth about abuse.
Absolutely.
One is not mutually exclusive to the other. It's how we want to distort the dialogue, which causes me concern, and it gets distorted. And I think that's what's a shame here. So I don't think the media handled it properly, but of course they want to sell, their whatever it is. I don't know if you print much anymore by way of newspapers, but they want to sell themselves. They want to be read. They want advertisers. So they're going to go after it that way.
What do you think this is down to? How they report this, because it is quite. I grew up in the noughties era. I don't want to guess which era you grew up. Maybe the 60s or the 70s or the 40s. I don't know. I
was born in 57.
57. All right. So yours is probably like 70s. So I grew up in an era where I actually saw this play out before the Me Too, and the discourse was very different because I actually did see the discourse around the Judy Arias trial. And I always say this to my friends: if that was played out again today, it would not be the same thing. Based on what was being alleged, it seems to have changed as the time went on after the Me Too movement. So, how much influence do you think activists has when it comes to when it comes to like looking at abuse, sexual assault, all of those? How much role how much influence do they have on the discourse, do you think?
I think it's a tremendous influence, and I think that there has been since the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even the early 2000s, a maturation in how we as a society and also the justice system understands intimate partner violence. And we needed that maturation because in the past, allegations could be ignored and people would suffer in silence. And this could be women, children, and men. We needed this activism to bring to light where we have failings in a system. What happened as a result of that, however, was the pendulum swinging too far in one direction where, everybody talked about, it was in the UK, I think it was the Metropolitan Police chief who had said a few years ago, we believe women. And then that was walked back recently in London. And we had, after one of our cases here, our police chief say, and this is now going back 3-4 years, we believe women. And that's a problem because police need to investigate crime, and the investigation shouldn't be different because of the gender of a complainant or the nature of an offense. It should be because they want to try and get it right.
Yeah.
So I think the activism was very important to help bring to light what were the problems in the system and to mature how we look at it and how we deal with it, and to provide greater support for victims of violence. But we have gone way too far where some have seized on a narrative that, everything is bad. And then if you make an allegation, it's true. And then people get canceled. They lose their jobs. They lose their livelihood. They lose their families. It got pretty bad. And I think we've seen, a bit of a walking back from that. But activism was very important, but it's also now gone a little too far. And I think it's created this conflict publicly, which is not helping address issues.
How do you interpret coercive control? Because I know that different system interprets it differently, but how is it interpreted over there? And how do you guys litigate it?
Well, I think it's very similar. So again, in the criminal sphere, we don't really have that concept creeping in, but it is in the litigation. So, right. And it's bail provisions. So if somebody's arrested on a domestic, then they have to consider as one of the factors coercive control, and that can come out in the complainant's evidence. And there's legitimacy to that. I mean, there are instances where a party to the marriage is controlling the other person financially. They don't have access to their own funds. They don't have their credit card, or they don't have their own credit card. And so that does exist.
Right.
And we see it in the family court system, because it's definitely in the family court system where that is, a concept that's now being litigated significantly. But it's not new. We call it coercive control, but they've said that all along anyways. It's been going on. So what do you do? So in a criminal case, this one case where I had with this couple, we're divorcing. When I had these emails and everything else, I had bank statements as well, where he got money from his family and to purchase a house, and she was drawing down on that deposit to pay her tuition and to pay all sorts of other stuff. And you've got emails going, honey, can we sort of stop that and maybe make an accounting? Because my parents had sent that to us to buy a house, and I didn't really want to use it for that. Please, And so I had evidence to counter the narrative about coercive control.
Right.
So you have to, again, try and have source information that can help you in that regard.
Right. So it's not, I was going to ask if coercive control is hard to prove, but it doesn't, is it hard to prove? Or is it just a matter of what do you have to say to speak to this?
Well, I mean, certainly a person who makes an allegation about coercive control can just say it and maybe believed on it. But, you got to dig down when you want to try and fight that off and see. So, for example, in one of the other cases, she said I wasn't allowed to travel. I wasn't allowed to see my family. Well, my client kept records. He bought 5 plane tickets to fly her to British Columbia, to fly her to the UK, and one to India. They happened to be South Asia. So we had all this. So I cross-examined. So I said, in the span of 24 months, you had 5 trips. All those 5 trips you went on your own. All those 5 trips you took the children. So when you say that you weren't allowed to travel, you're doing a lot of traveling. So you got to find the evidence to counter the narrative.
I completely understand. I mean, the reason why I asked the question, well, try to establish this little foundation of what it is because I think back in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong with the date. The Queen Elizabeth made a speech that they were going to introduce Domestic Abuse Act into the legislation. They did it in 2021, and coercive control was part of that act. So It is now something that I think it was explained to me that it was something that's now going to be used to bring charges like
in the UK, yes, not here yet.
Yeah, the other therapist told me that they used it for protective order reasons,
right.
To get it. What is it like over there? Like, how is it used? Is it criminals over here? Over there?
Yeah, so it's not a criminal offense on the books in Canada. So it's not a criminal offense on its own. It's factors to consider in bail. It is factors to consider in a case. So, abuse takes many forms. It can be coercive control and physical. So a complainant can testify about that, and you have to counter it. But in and of itself, it's not a criminal offense.
Right.
It is used in family court and can result in, damages or judgments that are in favor of the person who's being coercively controlled. But it's not a criminal offense on its own, and I don't think it should be.
Right. There's a lot of reforms has happened in regards to this case. Like they have brought in cameras over here for sentencing. They have changed anti-slap laws. Like anti-slap laws are now being implemented so that complainants. So that what's the word I'm looking for? Not prosecution. Flipping it. Plaintiffs. That's the one. So that plaintiffs will have to present a bit of evidence, not necessarily the fee shifting, because we have that here already by law, but they have to present evidence of what they have before they can pursue with the defamation claim. So some people could look at this and see it. Some people can look at this. Men specifically could look at this and think of it as a slap in the face, and I mean that with every pun intended. Because this, they probably see this as this is my only way to protect my reputation. It's now making it a lot harder, to bring a case. And the other side would say no, because sometimes people should be allowed to talk about this without fearing, litigation if they are being truthful. That they all these things. What do you think about how much these anti-slap laws are now being brought in? Because it's not just here in the UK. They're tightening up in various parts of the states. Very few states now have anti-slap anti-slap laws. I don't know what it is like in Canada, but yeah, what do you think about all the reforms that's happening?
Well, if something is said publicly and the party who is the subject of the comments feels that they have been defamed, in Canada you also have to show, if bringing an action, that there's some merit to it. So I don't think it is inappropriate or unfair to put forward some facts that would support your claim. Because it could get too easy to bury some people with the crushing notion of a civil action, especially if you've got one party who's wealthy and the other isn't. Again, to me, it's a question of balance, where we have to be careful about what speech is, how it does damage somebody, and when in fact there's legitimate issues of defamation. So I think we have to try and find balance with it. So amendments that would require a plaintiff to provide some factual foundation to support the legitimacy of the action, I think is appropriate. We see that anyway in other areas of law. I mean, if it's a spurious action, you can bring a summary judgment motion and knock it out. So I don't think that that's unreasonable. I just think that we need to be careful about how we talk about things, to make sure we're talking about things in a constructive manner, where we try and talk the truth, and in this day and age where we don't know what facts are anymore, I think it's dangerous.
There was also the other discourse that has been had, which was mutual abuse. Now, charity leaders like NCADV came out and said in a documentary done by NBC that mutual abuse doesn't exist. But I've seen discourse by therapists and that I've told. I said, no, this is actually true. It's just not called. It's just they don't like calling it mutual abuse. They call it bidirectional abuse. So I really
want a bad relationship.
Yeah, I want to know, like, what's your experience? Like, how common is mutual abuse? Is it common at all? Is it rare? Is it like a unicorn?
No, it's not a unicorn. I mean, we all know of somebody who's been in a divorce or been in a marriage where it hasn't been great and both parties were shitty to each other. And it occurs. I mean, look, you put two people under a house living together with stress and all sorts of other things, and it can get bad both ways. I mean, rarely is one party the angel, and the other is the demon. You know, it's not always. I mean, that happens, but you know, there are cases where unfortunately both parties are in a very toxic relationship where they're hurting each other, whether it is emotionally, psychologically, or a combination with violence, and it happens. I mean, it is not rare. Unfortunately, it exists, and it's, again, part of our society. It's how we are as human beings, and it just happens.
Right. Do you think mutual abuse happened in this case regarding Depp you heard, based on what you saw?
I can't comment, in trying to say what happened. I mean, I think it's clear that a certain part of the relationship was not healthy. Whenever it turned.
Right.
I don't think, we will know the complete truth.
Right.
But, clearly it dissolved very poorly, and I think everybody has something to blame for it. And when you introduce into a relationship addiction issues, it's not easy. So I don't think we'll ever know the true facts. She may have been telling the truth about certain things, but ultimately I think her credibility was extremely diminished, and I think the jury, in the circumstances, came to a very reasonable verdict.
How much does credibility factor into abuse claims and rape claims, etc., when they're being tried in court?
It's a central issue. Credibility and reliability are always central issues in most criminal cases, particularly so in domestic and sexual assault cases. I mean, credibility is extremely important.
Right.
And that's how you go about trying to establish whether your client is innocent or not. I don't like saying, I mean, the reality is you have to be on sort of the offensive to try and establish innocence in these cases. And credibility is a central issue.
Right. Oh, okay. Shifting gears a little bit, and we'll close out on this. I really do appreciate all the time that you've given me. We'll close out on this, and it's basically just I've heard the discourse of, well, I've heard these saying that, by a journalist that that basically says that activists are basically saying that it has taken women a lot of years to be heard, and they're finally being heard, after all those campaigning, etc. They're finally being heard now. And with male advocates of male victims, it's like, oh, after all that work, they're like, okay, but hear us out, they want to speak about, and here comes the men, to speak about their problems. What are your thoughts in regards to that little tidbit right there? Like, is that a fair way to sum this up?
Well, I think, again, it's a maturation of how we understand intimate partner violence.
Right. And
it has taken time for female victims to be heard and sometimes to have a fair trial.
Right.
So I think that's legitimate. The flip side is also, as we're learning more about abuse of men, which involves coercive control and sometimes violence, we are now seeing finally more men's shelters being built with actual funding to support them. We do see, sadly, that abuse can continue and will be promulgated in the family system. And I've happened to know two people who were both charged, and once the charges were drawn, couldn't survive the family court process because of the endless onslaught of allegations, committed suicide.
Right.
So, there are men doing that. And then I'll give you one other example. There was a parental alienation case, which was well known a couple of years ago here, where the husband, father, was able to establish that the child was being withheld, that there was parental alienation, that it was extremely bad. And then the mother was given like 72 hours to, provide the child to the father, and she killed the child and herself. So there has to be a maturation as well on the other side so that we understand issues in impacting men. Again, it's not mutually exclusive. I mean, I think it's about maturing as a society to understand what are the issues facing both, how do we deal with intimate partner violence, and that it impacts everybody. More so women are the victims of it, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen to men. It doesn't mean there's no such thing as a false allegation. Again, I think we all need balance in this discourse.
What are your thoughts in regards to having the discourse of abuse, rape, etc., in a manner which is gendered?
Yeah, so it's very gender specific. We have the polarization; it's male, female. I'm sure violence happens in all types of relationships, no matter what your gender or how you identify. We've represented people who are in same-sex marriages or same-sex relationships. I mean, it occurs everywhere.
Yeah.
The focus on gender, I think, is sometimes it will get us off course, where we need to talk more about what the issues are about intimate partner violence as opposed to male and female issues, right? Like, men are aggressive, women are this. I think it detracts from having a much more nuanced and meaningful discussion.
Right. So is it important then? Is it something that should be talked about in this context?
Well, it's a reality. I mean, we can't escape the fact that, a majority of offenses are committed by men.
Right.
We can't escape the fact that, men are more prone to violence. That said, again, we know this. Like, this is nothing new, okay? And there's a lot of factors at play as to why this happens. There's a lot of factors about mental health. There's a lot of factors about poverty. There's a lot of issues at play here. So we can't just look at gender. We need to look at what's the ideology of crime, what's the ideology of intimate partner violence, what are the other factors at play, and everybody gets impacted by this. There are victims on all sides. I think the problem, this is where we've seen, the movement go too far, and what it is now is the discussion is about the rarity of a false sexual assault claim, the rarity of a false domestic violence claim. And that is the danger. That's not true. There are false allegations. Because we know that, let's say, 60 or 70% of offenses may be committed by males, and we may have, a legitimacy rate of 70%.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that 30% of false allegations don't exist. It's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
And that's what we're pushed into. I had a post about something, and a lawyer wrote back, a female lawyer, saying, yeah, because women want to ruin their lives by claiming that they were sexually assaulted, right? And it's like, and my response was like, I don't understand you. Like, and it was saying that I'm cringe for, I hate that term, but, I'm cringe for posting that. And, you can't have a dialogue with this person because there's nothing meaningful to talk about. And I don't want to obscure what's important to talk about in this discourse by just focusing on gender. It's not a zero-sum game. We can't go that far to say everybody tells the truth. That's not true. People fucking lie. Why?
No one knows.
Why does the sun come up?
Why is the sky blue? Why do ducks swim? Why do ducks swim? Thank you so much, Joseph. I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to sit down and speak with me about this. Everyone go check out his channel, Not on Record. That's what it's called, right? Not on Record.
Not on Record, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, go check out his channel. Follow him on Twitter. Great lawyer doing great things.
Very kind.
Give my regards to Diana Davidson as well. Like, I love her content. I watched her years ago, and she's so funny. I watched her when I was in uni, around 2013, 14 or something like around that time. And she was doing those short form content about female nature, and like, she went viral in my uni. Like, she was a sensation here. She was a sensation.
I will definitely let her know. She'll be very happy to hear that.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks,